Please, order. The topic for late debate has been submitted and reads, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly require the Minister of Finance to take leadership on this important issue and find an immediate resolution to the Auditor General's concerns. Submitted by the Honourable Member for Cape Breton West. Daily routine, presenting and reading of petitions. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to make an introduction before tabling a petition.
Oh, certainly.
In our West Gallery, we have some guests with us today. They are salaried, non-unionized pensioners of New Page, Port Hawkesbury. And as I read their name, I'll ask that they stand. Kathy McLean, Muriel McNeil, Brian McNeil, Clark Brander, Jerry Peters, Russ Waycott, Mary McDonald, William Innes, Ruth Innes, Gerard French, Sandy McDonald, Sam Moran, Roddy McDonald, Winston England, Grace England, William Cotton, Giselle Urquhart, Robert Urquhart, and Lorna McCrory. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask all members of the Legislature to give our guests a warm welcome here today.
We welcome all our guests to today's proceedings and hope you have an enjoyable day. I will now recognize the Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition. It is the operative clause being, we respectfully ask that the government give urgent attention to the protection of the value of the current pensions of retired New Page Port Hawkesbury employees and the future pension value for current employees. This petition has been signed by 175 people, and I have included myself as the 176th signee on this petition, and I would wish to table that at this time.
The petition is tabled. Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, last week I was asked by the Honourable Member opposite how much the province paid per kilometre of chip seal since introducing the provincial chip seal crew this year. Well, Mr. Speaker, it's good news. The news is so good, in fact, that I've decided to share it with the news with all members present. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to update the House on how much we paid, in fact, how much we saved this year since introducing the provincial chip seal crew in August. Mr. Speaker, in 2008-9, under the previous government, the province was paying $91,000 per kilometre of double chip seal. $91,000, Mr. Speaker. That's not an estimate, that's a fact. It was too much money, Mr. Speaker. Well, how did we know that? The department looked at other provinces. It was significantly more than what was being charged in other provinces, particularly New Brunswick. Mr. Speaker, it's no surprise to our government that since we introduced the provincial chip sealing crew this year, the costs have gone down significantly. I'm pleased to report the tender prices we paid per kilometre for double chip seal was $40,000. $40,000 this paving season, Mr. Speaker. That's less than half of what we were paying before.
Hear, hear.
Now, why did that happen, Mr. Speaker? Well, it happened because our government took the initiative to introduce a provincial chip sealing crew. It happened because the province recognized that it was being charged too much and our government was going to do something about it. Not only is the province now paying less for tenders, the provincial chip seal crew can do the work for much less than what was being charged in 2009. They can lay double chip seal at a cost of $46,000 per kilometre. Even if you add in the one-time only startup costs, such as equipment preparation and the time to train a new crew, we're talking about $50,000, which is still significantly less than the tender prices in 2009. Mr. Speaker, by introducing a provincial chip seal crew who can do the work for significantly less than what we were being charged by the private sector, we can now be assured that in the future, tenders will continue to be less than half of what we paid in 2008 and 9. So just imagine, Mr. Speaker, the money this province would have saved and the roads we could have paved if the government had done this 10 years earlier. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, the province wasn't getting competitive bids on the vast majority of our chip sealing tenders. In 2009, the province received only 2 bids on all of its chip sealing tenders, and they were all from the same 2 companies. 2 bids, 2 companies, tender after tender. In 2010, the same 2 bidders dropped their prices to less than half what they were charging in 2009. That's no coincidence, Mr. Speaker. Those lower prices are a direct result of the action this government took. As the minister responsible for transportation infrastructure renewal, I'm not interested in the inflated profit margin for road builders. In all good conscience, Mr. Speaker, this minister is interested in seeing what's best for the value for taxpayers and their needs when it comes to safe roads. Mr. Speaker, the facts speak for themselves. This decision has saved the province money. In fact, the province saved $2.3 million that we've been able to reinvest to make Nova Scotia's highways and roads safer. I'm pleased at this time to table the cost comparison chart for all members to see. I know it will be read intently as we look at this important subject. We want to be sure that we can pave as many kilometers of road as possible at a cost we can afford. I would think Nova Scotians would expect nothing less than a government, particularly this government. By paying less, the province is able to pave more. I also want to remind the members of this House that the last 3 provincial highway budgets, our government has introduced what have been record-setting budgetary amounts. The total amount of money our government has spent on Nova Scotia roads, highways, and bridges is close to $1 billion, $1 billion over 3 years. That's a significant investment, Mr. Speaker. The chip seal work that has generated so much interest lately represents just $2 million of our overall highway improvement budget. That's less than 0.5% of that $1 billion total. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. We and I, as a minister, value our partnership with road builders. They still do the vast majority of provincial road work. The province is responsible for more than 23,000 kilometers of road. There's plenty of work to go around. In fact, when looking at just chip sealing projects, we still expect more than $6 million of the $8 million the province will spend for chip seal each year will continue to flow to the private sector. There's no danger of them going out of business. Mr. Speaker, the province's chip seal initiative is a long-term project. It's a 3-year commitment. At the end of those 3 years, the province will have an audit done to evaluate how we've pursued this issue. Mr. Speaker, the province is paying less and we are paving more. Based on our experience so far, our government is confident that we are correct to move ahead with our asphalt plant. The tender closed today, in fact, Mr. Speaker. The crew will be operational in 2012. Taking this step will ensure the province continues to provide quality roads, help to maximize federal dollars, work more effectively with communities and road builders, and reach more communities while living within our means. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I've always encouraged feedback from my fellow MLAs on either side of the House. I've already received requests from all parties asking where we are going to do the chip sealing next year and where the asphalt plant is going to be operating. That decision has yet to be made, but any member feels there is a need in his or her community, please come to speak to me directly and we'll consider your requests. Your constituents are counting on you. They want to see an asphalt plant or a chip seal crew operated by this government in their community, and I encourage members opposite and members of this side of the House to make their views known on this important topic. Thank you for your time today, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Minister for an advance copy of his statement, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if I was the member opposite he was referring to, but I think I'm one of the ones who have asked questions regarding the cost of doing chip sealing by the government. But before I get to that particular question that I had asked, which is not answered in here, what I wanted to go back to a couple of other things that were stated inside of the statement, and I think would help all of us and all Nova Scotians to fairly assess whether or not the province should be in the tendering business, Mr. Speaker. We have asked repeatedly to verify and have government explain to us where the 91,000 per kilometre has come up, where they've come from 2008 to 2009. Mr. Speaker, we have the private sector telling us that number was much less, which their number is about 39,000. Mr. Speaker, government has a different view. What we're asking and what we've asked for and will continue to ask for in this House is that we see some verification of where that number originated from. Let's not just throw a number out there without backing up with solid information, quite frankly, so those of us on this side of the House can then ask whether or not it is good value for money for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, that's what we've asked for when it comes to what's happening inside of the tendering process. Another aspect that has happened, that has changed since 2008-9 to the present day, when it comes to chip sealing, Mr. Speaker, there's one part of the process has been taken out. It's called priming. Mr. Speaker, the private sector had asked the previous government to respond and remove that aspect from the process. And at that time, they said there'd be tremendous savings for the people of Nova Scotia. They chose not to. But I know the government and the minister responded and has removed that from that process. That has affected the price of tendering, and that, Mr. Speaker, I want to congratulate the minister on listening to the private sector, professional people in the Road Builders Association, who saw a way for the taxpayers to save money, Mr. Speaker, and he paid attention. I want to congratulate him for that. But I want to go back to here, we talked about, and one of the questions that I had asked in the House was for the minister to explain to all Nova Scotians how much it cost per kilometre of the roads that were paved by the chip sealing plant owned and operated by the province. Mr. Speaker, that is not in this document in the sense, when we look at the $40,000 number, Mr. Speaker, that is comparing, in our view, and if the minister may correct this, it is comparing the private sector tenders that government had received. That's the private sector. Mr. Speaker, responding not to the government's issue of paving 30 kilometres, they're responding, quite frankly, to the competition that all of us knew was coming. Mr. Speaker, if you look in our neighbouring province of New Brunswick, that government has changed its road building budget. Companies have come into here, and we all know from all of our communities that there's a large company in New Brunswick who bought a Nova Scotia company and is driving down price, Mr. Speaker, based on one thing alone: private sector competition. Nothing more, nothing less. Private sector competition is driving down that price, Mr. Speaker, which we said over a year ago. Mr. Speaker, let's think for a moment, and I want everyone to think about this for a second. Do you honestly believe that the private sector, if they believe that the government was going to get into building roads, that they're going to eat away at their profit margins, they were going to take away their business, do you honestly believe that they would have been frightened by 30 kilometres and drove down their prices? The exact opposite. They would have kept their prices high. They would have kept their prices high, Mr. Speaker. That's what would have happened. And then we move forward, Mr. Speaker. What we've asked for, and we'll continue to ask for, is verification of these numbers. Mr. Speaker, it is important that Nova Scotians get the best value for their buck. If the government believes that it's theirs, then what we want to know is, what is the kilometres that they have paved and how much does that cost us as a province individually? And Mr. Speaker, compare that to the private sector. It is important. It is important as we go forward that we get a real sense of how much does this cost us. And Mr. Speaker, one of my other questions that I had to the minister was this: while we continue to evaluate the chip sealing plant and find out whether or not it is good value for the people of this province, to find out whether or not that it is in the best interest of the province to continue down this road, let's halt the idea of entering into the paving business until we can do a full assessment. In the minister's remarks, he talked about a 3-year window to audit. Mr. Speaker, we think that window is okay. Let's look at that. Let's step back, and before we enter into the asphalt business, let's look at whether or not we're getting good value and compare apples to apples. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to ask these questions. I look forward as we go further down the road to get clarification on the 91,000, Mr. Speaker. And furthermore, I look forward to get a real number on how much it actually cost us to pave those 39 kilometres that the government chip sealed, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I can hardly believe my ears today listening to the boasting of the government. Mr. Speaker, the government's new chip sealing crew only completed 10% of the work that they were supposed to do. They only completed 40 kilometres out of the 366 that they had promised in the business plan they used to justify the government's entry into the paving and chip sealing business. Mr. Speaker, this underwhelming accomplishment cost taxpayers $1.4 million for equipment. That leaves only $600,000 for other costs. Would the government have us believe that all the materials used, the salaries for the 26 crew members, the accommodations, the training, the planning and setup costs at the new department for this new venture by the government all came in at under $2 million? Mr. Speaker, the costs are substantial. We can be assured of that. But they are especially substantial when you consider that the crew double chip sealed only 1 kilometre each day. That's right, on average 1 kilometre each day. So now the government claims that the total costs for that 1 kilometre are $50,000. The industry has expressed to us that they feel, on a conservative estimate basis, that that number is more likely $65,000 per kilometre. And that is more than $15,000 per kilometre than the prices of the numerous companies who do this type of work. So let me get this straight. The government is boasting about double chip sealing for $50,000 a kilometre when the cost may really be closer to $65,000, when our road building companies are doing it for $40,000. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't add up. In fact, at $50,000 per kilometre, if we take the government's word, if the government chip sealing crew had to bid on tenders, like every other road building company in this province, they wouldn't have been awarded any of the work. So it is also misleading of the government to claim that their actions have led to lower prices. The New Brunswick comparison, we don't feel is accurate, because the tendering in New Brunswick, the practices there are for much larger volumes of work. They're more closely geographically located. And another significant point, one of the key differences between the estimates that the minister has referenced from the past 10 years, those estimates included, by industry's own comments, an additional cost of about $18,000 per year. So we're not comparing apples to apples, Mr. Speaker. And I should point out a small point, but one that's important for in rural Nova Scotia, is all the private truck drivers, all the dump truck operators who, when the province has in the past tendered out this work, benefited from the 80-20 rule in that they were able to gain opportunities to do work on these projects. But with the government doing it now, they are going to be out of business on those opportunities. So the industry feels that heightened competition between the two biggest companies have kept costs lower. Increased competition from New Brunswick has really been the reason that costs have been kept lower. Why would having a government chip sealing crew lead to lower prices when it doesn't have to bid on tenders? For this government to claim that they have kept costs lower when they have never submitted a bid on a tender is a dubious claim. The small amount of work that they did do had no impact on the overall volume of road work in the province this past year. So it's hard to imagine that that small volume of work impacted on the pricing of chip sealing. And for them to claim that they paid less to pave more, it just doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotian taxpayers paid more. They paid more for every kilometre, all 40 kilometres of it. So today, the government is spending more taxpayers' money, millions more on an asphalt plant. The tender closes today, as the minister mentioned, and he says that the government is confident that they are right to move forward. Without the benefit of a fair bidding process for work, how can Nova Scotians be assured that the government isn't just wasting their money? $50,000 per kilometre for double chip sealing, or as the industry maintains, it may be closer to $65,000, when the competitive industry already in place in Nova Scotia is doing it for under $40,000. So, Mr. Speaker, we believe that this situation could have been fixed with better tendering practice. And when we think that we complimented the government when they came out with their 5-year plan, because we agree that it should help companies to be able to respond to tenders more quickly so that we could get the paving projects going earlier in the construction season. But this year, we've seen that only 50% of tenders were released by August, which is well into the construction season. So, Mr. Speaker, that is where the problem really lies. And I know that it's also been mentioned in the legislature, it's been raised, that some of the members on the government side have actually had paving work completed in their ridings. So we wonder if this is not about saving money, is it about control? So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will close my remarks.
Thank you. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
Mr. Speaker, I do this notice of motion on behalf of the Minister of Seniors. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia boasts many talented artists and inspiring sites, and whereas the Nova Scotia Seniors Art and Photo Gallery provides artists and photographers 50 years of age and older a central location to display and sell their works of art, and whereas this one-of-a-kind art gallery located at the World Trading Convention Centre is celebrating its 100th showing, therefore be it resolved that the members of the legislature congratulate the Nova Scotia Seniors Art and Photo Gallery on its 100th art and photo show and wish them much success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on average 394 Canadians die every week from lung cancer, and 450 Canadians are diagnosed with lung cancer on a weekly basis. And whereas lung cancer is caused by many lifestyle and environmental factors, such as smoking tobacco or long-term exposure to secondhand smoke and air pollution. And whereas lung cancer continues to be a leading cause of death for both men and women, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join me in marking Lung Cancer Awareness Month and show leadership in making healthy lifestyle choices. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. J. Fraser Mustard, who passed away on November the 16th, 2011, was a leader in the areas of early childhood learning and the role of communities. And whereas as a founding member of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, Dr. Mustard made an extraordinary contribution to the world's understanding of how social and economic factors affect early childhood development. And whereas Dr. Mustard was known all over the globe for emphasizing the importance of early childhood development to society. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly recognize the important contributions Dr. Mustard has made to early childhood education in Canada and send our deepest condolences to his family. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia's public libraries are important resources that support vibrant communities through programs that encourage lifelong learning. And whereas October was Canadian Library Month, a month designated by the Canadian Library Association to raise awareness around libraries and information services in Canada. And whereas commemorating this month, the Office of Gaelic Affairs chose to raise awareness of the Gaelic culture by donating several recent works of Nova Scotia Gaelic language and culture to the People's Place Library in Antigonish, where many Gaelic-speaking Nova Scotians live. Therefore, be it resolved that this House join me in congratulating the Office of Gaelic Affairs for helping to advance the profile of Gaelic culture in the area and provide additional Gaelic-based resources for those who frequent the People's Place Library in Antigonish. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on September 29th, Cape Bretoners turned out in full force to support the Cape Breton Cares Radiothon by raising more than $500,000 during a live 12-hour broadcast to support specialized care at the regional hospital. And whereas this fundraiser would not have been possible without the support of volunteers, sponsors, entertainers, and donors who over the 4 years the Radiothon has been taking place have raised a total of $1.5 million. And whereas the funds of this year's Radiothon will support a number of the hospital's priority areas, including the Cape Breton Cancer Centre, Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, Pediatrics, the Ancala Palliative Care Unit, Renal Dialysis Unit, and the Intensive Care Unit. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join me in thanking Cape Bretoners for their generosity and in congratulating the volunteers, sponsors, entertainers, and donors for their hard work and dedication to the regional hospital. And Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notices of motion. The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the first annual Pumpkin Idol was held on October 8th, where more than 100 people gathered at Victoria Park in Windsor to watch 11 talented contestants competing for cash prizes. And whereas Heather Donahue of Hens Uniforms and Wendy Geddes of Readers Haven to Use Books teamed up to lead the Windsor Business Enhancement Society's marketing initiative that resulted in one well-attended day of fun for all. And whereas the debut of Windsor's Pumpkin Idol raised more than $300 for Evanview's band program, and organizers Heather and Wendy say that it will only get bigger and better in the second annual Pumpkin Idol and for the years to come. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Heather Donahoe and Wendy Geddes on a very successful first annual Pumpkin Idol and wish them continued success in future events. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bruce Strum, whose environmental consulting company, Strum Environmental, has grown since its inception in Bedford in 1985 to employ 35 people. And whereas Strum Environmental has done business all over Atlantic Canada, as far away as Yellowknife and England and the Caribbean, and has worked on such projects as Emera's Muskrat Falls, the Melford International Terminal, and the Gulf Force development. And whereas Bruce Strum says the Halifax region is his chosen place of business because there are good business people here with ethics and morals and who still do work based on a handshake and an understanding. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Bruce Strum for his business acumen and encourage him from his head office in Bedford to continue doing business the maritime way. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the province of Nova Scotia and the government of Scotland have continued to build upon the vision of the Memorandum of Understanding signed by then Tourism Minister Rodney MacDonald in 2002. And whereas Nova Scotia and Scotland have recognized the importance of maintaining the rich Gaelic cultural ties of our people by supporting shared experiences in language education, culture, and economic development. And whereas a new bursary program has been established to recognize the unique connection that exists between the Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland and Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly acknowledge Alistair Allen, Minister for Gaelic with the Scottish Government, for providing £10,000 each year for bursaries to support young Nova Scotian Gaelic speakers who visit Scotland for summer language training. Agus ansa Gaelic. Seachgun do chum rialtas na halba agus na halba nue. Suas lershin a mirachan cordig vo 2002. Rish and do chur rory donawach anim nuor avai na minister a turasach culture as is dulchas. Agus. Seachgun do gav alba is alba ur suim anavi gleag Hien glichen, Brimor, Brivor, Cultural, Gael, Levi, Torsch, Teich, Do Lesachug, Kochen, Anan Canon, Foglum, Culture, Agus, Ioconomus, Agus, Shechgun, Do Churi, Ervan, Program, Skaliarach, I need a shot of whiskey, perhaps. Ervan program Skaliarachag Ur a Torsh Anya Dor and Dive Erich a Eter Gael Tachag Nahalaba Agus Nahalaba Nuag Marshin Big a Narunek Gach Bal Dan Falamet Show Gun Achnicht Alistair Alain Minister na Gaelic an Realtas na Hawaba Hunes gun Jech 10,000 punt a hur ma Sheach Gach Blina son Teich do Gael Oka a Alba Nuig a H Turas a Halaban da Hunsachug Canon as Soundrak. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal.
English. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the world's greatest hockey player, Sidney Crosby of Cole Harbour, was sidelined for 10 months as a result of a concussion sustained during play, whereas Sidney has worked diligently and faithfully to not just recover from his injury, but to condition and train so that he could continue to excel in his sport and his passion of hockey. Whereas in last evening's game pitting Pittsburgh against Washington, Sid showed the results of his hard work and talent by scoring the first goal of the game and 4 points overall, 2 goals and 2 helpers. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognizes the extraordinary efforts of this talented young man, Sidney Crosby of Cole Harbour, congratulates him on his return to the game, and wishes him all the very best in his hockey career in the many years ahead. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
With an amendment, I would consider that because they played the Islanders last night, not the Capitals. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on the future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bill Sweatman of Sheffield Mills passed away in March 2011 after spending his entire life in agriculture, after graduating from the Nova Scotia Agricultural College in 1956, where he soon became involved in poultry farming and was one of the founding members of the Nova Scotia Turkey Marketing Board. And whereas Bill served on the Nova Scotia Farm Loan Board, the Farm Practice Board, and also the Agricultural Land Review Committee, he considered one of his most important roles was to preserve agricultural land in Kings County. And whereas Bill has combined dedication, commitment, and community leadership in many ways while serving as a scout leader, member of the Annapolis Valley Health Services, and teaching Sunday school. Therefore, be it resolved, the family of the late Bill Sweatman received the gratitude of this House for a lifetime of dedication to church, community recreation, and agriculture in this province. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Walter and Elaine Soller of Sydney were presented with the 2011 Best Real Estate Sales Office Award, and whereas Walter and Elaine Soller are the proud owners of PropertyGuys.com Cape Breton, which is the reason for this award, and whereas the Sollers received this award recently from the Sydney and Area Chamber of Commerce, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Walter and Elaine Soller, owners of PropertyGuys.com, on this award as they continue working hard to build their business. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Valley Animal Shelter, located within the Wolfville Animal Hospital, was started in 1988 by Dr. Peter Bly, who saw the need to help stray and abandoned cats in the Kings County area. And whereas the Valley Animal Shelter is needed to help the overpopulation of cats in the Wolfville area, and whereas the Valley Animal Shelter ensures the well-being of healthy cats so they can be adopted to loving and good family homes. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize the important work and diligence by the Valley Animal Shelter in helping control the feral cat population in the town of Wolfville and the surrounding communities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the President's Award Diamond Club, Ford of Canada's highest dealership honour, is presented annually to those dealerships which demonstrate outstanding achievement in sales and customer satisfaction. And whereas Ford of Canada is recognizing Ford and Lincoln dealers for providing a superior customer experience in sales, service, and overall dealership experience, and whereas Tri-County Ford in Tatamagouche, Colchester North is among the elite group of Ford and Lincoln dealerships to be recognized as part of the President's Award Diamond Club, therefore be it resolved, all members of the House of Assembly extend our congratulations to Tri-County Ford for receiving this prestigious national award and for their dedication to their customers. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ingonish borders the 950 square kilometre Cape Breton Highlands National Park and consists of the 5 distinct communities of Ingonish Ferry, Ingonish Harbour, Ingonish Beach, Ingonish Centre, and North Ingonish. And whereas on Saturday, November 26th, the beauty of the Ingonish Beach area will be on display as the community celebrates their annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony. And whereas, as a result of the efforts of many community volunteers, community residents and visitors will see a parade of floats travel through Ingonish Beach to the Celtic Lodge. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly applaud the volunteer efforts of those community volunteers and wish them every success in this year's festivities. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day to move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Woods Harbour third baseman Bailey Cameron competed in the Baseball Canada's Bantam Girls National Championship in North York, Ontario on July the 27th to the 31st as a member of the Nova Scotia Bantam Girls team. And whereas Nova Scotia Bantam Girls were the bronze medalists in the 5-team tournament, marking the first national medal ever for a female team from Atlantic Canada. And whereas the 14-year-old Bailey Cameron was awarded a game MVP award during the tournament for her performance on the pitching mound, where she racked up 5 strikeouts in 2 innings. Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate Bailey Cameron and the Nova Scotia Bantam girls baseball team for bringing home the bronze medal from the national championship. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Carol Cook Perkins was raised in the village of Isaacs Harbour, Nova Scotia, and moved to Halifax at the age of 16 to further her education and to work. Met and married her husband George and has been happily married for the past 48 years. And moved to Dartmouth with their son Christopher 41 years ago, where they preside today. Whereas Carolyn worked in various office jobs and accepted a position known at the time as the Department of National Revenue Taxation for 31 years until she retired and shortly after accepted a job with MLA Dr. Jim Smith in Dartmouth East as his constituency assistant, and has been with the current Preston MLA as his constituency assistant since 2003. Whereas Carolyn has volunteered for blind sport, Dartmouth Literacy, Caledonia Minor Soccer Association, and the president of the Ivan Forsyth Home and School Association, among others. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House acknowledge Carol Cook Perkins for many contributions to our community and our province. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Youth Inclusion Program Summer Program provides at-risk youth with employment training, conflict resolution training, and arts-based programming. And whereas the focus of this program is to help change young people's attitudes and educate them on healthy activities and lifestyles through participation in a whole range of activities. And whereas Project Coordinator Heather McNeil and staff member Andy Curry have witnessed countless youth turn their lives around through the program. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly recognize the significance of this program in helping rehabilitating youth at risk, and thank Heather McNeil, Andy Curry, and all the staff at the Youth Inclusion for their commitment to young people. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for the Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce held its first Best of Pictou County People's Choice Awards with 800 nominations in 25 categories. And whereas the contest for Best of Pictou County People's Choice Awards voting was done online with over 1,000 choices received. Whereas this year's winner was the Best Accommodation was won by Stoneham Chalets, which is located in Scottsburn, Pictou County, and is owned and operated by the Gunn family of Scottsburn. Therefore, it be resolved that the members of the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly congratulate Stoneham Chalets and the Gunn family on winning the Pictou County People's Choice Awards for Best Accommodations. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Salem United Church, located at Tatamagouche Mountain, Colchester North, and whereas on September 11th, 2011, the congregation gathered to celebrate the church's 125th anniversary, and whereas the celebration included Speaker Reverend Dr. Douglas McCacken and a guest choir from the Harmony Camden United Church, and therefore be it resolved all members of this House of Assembly congratulate the Salem United Church on this occasion of their 125th anniversary. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kimberly McMillan had the crown placed on her head after being named Queen during the Parsborough Old Home Week activities for 2011. And whereas Kimberly is a 17-year-old who is active in the Youth Town Council, basketball, hockey, soccer, softball, volleyball, photography, and much more. And whereas Kimberly McMillan appeared in the Grand Street Parade and will appear in many other events over the year, while serving as a role model for local youth with a community-minded outlook. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Kimberly McMillan on being named Queen of the Parsboro Old Home Week and wish her much success in all her future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the member of the legislature for Truro Bible Hill is an acclaimed performer of stage and screen who is actively involved in the arts, particularly in her constituency of Truro Bible Hill. And whereas the member of the legislature for Truro Bible Hill has released her debut CD, Change the World One Day at a Time, which was recorded in Halifax and features 13 songs, including 6 by maritime artists. And whereas today, November 22nd, 2011, the member of the legislature for Truro Bible Hill is celebrating her birthday. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly extends congratulations to the member of the legislature for Truro Bible Hill on the launch of her debut CD and recognizes her leadership role as an ambassador for our creative economy and wish her a very happy birthday. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in the past year, employment in rural Nova Scotia has taken a tremendous hit under this NDP government, with 2,100 jobs lost in Cape Breton, 1,400 jobs lost in the North Shore region, 600 jobs lost in the Valley region, 2,500 jobs left in the southern region of Nova Scotia. Whereas in the past year, the workforce has shrunk under the NDP government by 2,300 in Cape Breton, 1,400 in the North Shore region, 1,800 in the Valley region, and 4,300 in the southern region. And whereas this NDP government took office, more than 1,500 more Nova Scotians are out of work, and 14,800 more Nova Scotians have exited the workforce. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House of Assembly strongly urge the NDP government to stop ignoring the economy and finally address the critical issues of rural job losses in Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 17-year-old Rebecca Blakeney, a bilingual honours student at Cabot High, was crowned Miss Teen Cape Breton 2011 on August 26th. And whereas Ms. Blakeney, who was pursuing a career in archaeology, represented Ingonish and impressed judges with her charming personality, artistic abilities, academic ability, and incredible stage performance. And whereas her values and enthusiasm for life will become a positive influence to all youth across Cape Breton. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly extend congratulations to Rebecca on being crowned Miss Teen Cape Breton 2011 and wish her all the best in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas small businesses provide the lifeblood to our towns and rural communities, and whereas the 10 to 20 project is encouraging our small businesses to work together to attract today's customers, and whereas Queens County's 10 to 20 project is actively highlighting the benefits of spending money locally and the effects of doing so on the economy of Queens County through promotions, workshops, and distribution of information and tangible statistics.
Therefore, be it resolved that the House of Assembly recognizes and congratulates the 10 to 20 project of Queens County for its proactive role in revitalizing its local economy. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Same
Cape Breton West, sorry.
Uh-oh, if I start to look like that, I'm in trouble, huh? The only thing we have in common, Mr. Speaker, is we have the same tailor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas recently, Sean Coyle shared with the Board of Directors of the Sydney and Area Chamber of Commerce his desire to resign his position as Executive Director. And whereas Sean now has plans of going into business locally in Sydney, and whereas during Sean's tenure, he has accomplished a great deal to stabilize financial and administrative procedures in the organization and also help grow the Chamber membership. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly thank Sean Coyle for his service to the Sydney Area Chamber of Commerce and wish him every success in his new business venture. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver, is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Antigonish.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Antigonish resident Molly Thomason is a talented musician who has accomplished much by a relatively young age, and whereas at the age of 14, Molly was the youngest ever recipient of an emerging music grant from then Nova Scotia Department of Tourism and Culture for her work on her debut CD, which was also nominated for New Artist Recording of the Year during Molson Canadian Nova Scotia Music Week in 2009. And whereas on May 27th, Molly Thomason released her second CD, Beauty Queen, with a concert in Antigonish and was nominated in 2 categories at the 2011 Nova Scotia Music Awards. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House congratulate Molly Thomason on her many musical achievements and wish her all the best with her future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas last week during question period, the Minister of Health and Wellness was evasive in defence of her department's review of publicly funded vaccination programs. And whereas the Minister refused to rule out whether cuts are coming to vaccination programs currently being offered and provided no indication as to who she will be consulting around potential changes. And whereas vaccines are considered to be among the most cost-effective health interventions because they reduce the economic burden of illness both in the workplace and in institutional settings and ensure a health and productive population. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House urge the Minister of Health and Wellness to come clean and tell Nova Scotians what plans she has in mind for Nova Scotia's publicly funded vaccination program. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? No. I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll be introducing this resolution on behalf of the honourable member for Cumberland South. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I will move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Ryan Baker, a grade 10 student at Spring Hill High School, led a grade 12 program crash course in the Korean martial arts of Taekwondo, and whereas Ryan has been a practitioner of Taekwondo and other martial arts for 2.5 years and is well on his way to a black belt, and whereas Ryan has worked hard over the years and is already making the transition into a leadership role, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Ryan Baker on his outstanding achievement in the field of Taekwondo and wish him continued success in the future. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hammonds Plains, Upper Sackville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that at a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on June 25th, 2011, Grand Day for Cobequid was held on Grand Lake in support of Cobequid Community Health Centre Foundation in Lower Sackville. And whereas the event included approximately 60 participants and raised $76,000, which will fund an EKG for the health center's cardiology clinic. And whereas lighthearted, fun, and engaging events such as this brings together the community in support of improving our local health centers, which assists with the health and well-being of ourselves and our families. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House of Assembly recognize the significant contributions that Grand Day for Cobequid contribute to the Cobequid Community Health Centre Foundation and congratulate them on raising $76,000, which will fund an EKG for the health center's cardiology unit. Clinic. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Same Taylor. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mildred Kettlewell noticed the outside garden courtyard at Harbourview Hospital in Sydney Mines had fallen into disrepair while her husband Glenn was a patient at the rehab facility. And whereas Mildred spent all winter getting donations and in the spring, her family worked on the garden, cutting back the brush, weeding and planting. And whereas today the courtyard garden is a brilliant mixture of flowers, trees and shrubs with benches, swings where patients can spend quiet, quality time. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating the Kettlewells for their initiative and hard work and for improving the experience for patients and their families at Harbourview Hospital. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas over 40,000 student athletes participate annually in school sport programs throughout the province, and whereas Nova Scotia Schools Athletic Federation annually organizes the celebration of school sport to celebrate participation, fair play, and service to school sport and reinforce the significant role interscholastic athletics plays in education. And whereas Haley Gould, daughter of Lisa and Tony Gould, and the student at West Hants Middle School was the female recipient of Celebration of School Sport 2010-11 Award for demonstrating respect for others and displaying a true example of good sportsmanship. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly congratulate Haley on receiving this award and wish her all the best. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Agri group of employees, together with its 6 families of owners, are celebrating their 40th anniversary of farming in the Annapolis Valley, and whereas the Nova Agri Group decided to celebrate their anniversary by contributing to the health of the community in which their customers and employees live with a $50,000 donation to the Our Community, Our Health campaign of the Valley Health Revitalization Project, and whereas the Nova Agri Group of companies is comprised of Dykeview Farms Limited, Nova Agri Inc., Blueberry Acres, Between the Bushes Restaurant, Salad Acres, and Vitalberry Farms, and their operations have expanded to include packing, marketing, research, product process development, and agritourism. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia House of Assembly congratulates the Nova Agri Group of companies on its 40th anniversary of farming in the Valley and for its many contributions to the economy and health of our community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Yes. There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you. I'm reading this resolution, Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my friend, the member for Lunenburg. Whereas Recipe to Riches on the Food Network is a new competitive reality series where each week Canadian home cooks battle to have their original recipes become a President's Choice product, win $25,000 and become eligible for a grand prize of $250,000. And whereas Lunenburg native Glo McNeil, an 82-year-old grandmother with a passion for the arts and a flair in the kitchen, entered the Recipe to Riches competition with her recipe for luscious lemon pudding, and whereas Glo McNeil won the first round and $25,000 in the sweet puddings and pies category with her luscious lemon pudding, with the product being adapted for production by the show's corporate sponsor, Loblaws, under its President's Choice brand. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulates Glo McNeil on winning $25,000 and seeing her product placed in Loblaws stores in the Recipe to Riches contest, and wishes her luck in her quest to win the grand prize of $250,000. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm reading this resolution on behalf of my colleague, the MLA for Guysborough, Sheet Harbour. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Guysborough Academy student Kayleen Hines was selected from more than 1,000 applicants across Canada to take part in the Shad Valley program, which is designed to focus on innovation, entrepreneurship, science, and technology. And whereas Shad Valley is a nonprofit program in operation for over 30 years in 30 Canadian universities, the participants of which are 500 of the brightest Canadian school students selected through a highly competitive application process. And whereas in July 2011, Kayleen successfully participated in this prestigious program, which enabled her to learn new skills, make new friends, and bring her unique talents and perspectives to the table. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House of Assembly congratulate Kayleen Hines on her selection to and participation in this impressive program and wish her well in her future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on September 24th, 2011, at the Hubbard Save Easy, the St. Margaret's Bay Pumpkin Growers Association held its annual weigh-off. And whereas the winners for the men's division are as follows. First place went to Leo Swinimer. His pumpkin weighed 485 pounds. Second place went to George Manuel. His pumpkin was 273. And third place went to Russell Coolin with a pumpkin weighing 266 pounds. And whereas the winners for the women's division are as follows. The first place went to Avis Swinimer, and her pumpkin was one of the heaviest, weighing 534 pounds. Second place went to Laurie McLeod with 179 pounds, and the youth winner was Taylor Snare, his pumpkin weighing 185 pounds. And the winner for the field pumpkin was Fenton McGuinness with a 116-pound pumpkin. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulates all the winners in this year's pumpkin weigh-off and wishes them all the best for next season. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. I now recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request that the House revert back to tabling reports, regulations, and other papers.
The motion is to revert back. All those in favor say aye. All those against say nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if I might have permission to introduce someone before I table this report. In the Speaker's Gallery, I'm very pleased and proud this afternoon to introduce Don Bureau, President of the Nova Scotia Community College, and I ask him to stand and be recognized by my colleagues.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a report, the 2011 report to the community by the Nova Scotia Community College.
The report is tabled. The time now is for oral questions put by members to ministers. It is 1:14 and we will finish at 2:14. The Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, since taking office, the Premier has been raising taxes and fees while remaining silent on power, gas, and food prices have been skyrocketing. The Premier's failed approach has taken its toll on Nova Scotians who are struggling to keep up with their expenses, on businesses who are finding Nova Scotia simply an uncompetitive environment to do business. It is also taking its toll on the job market, Mr. Speaker. In the Premier's first month in power, employment was at 461,900, and today it is at 449,400. Mr. Speaker, that's a loss of 12,500 jobs on the Premier's watch. So my question to the Premier, who does the Premier want to blame those job losses on today?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition is playing games. He knows that if he compares June to June, there were 3,000 more jobs in Nova Scotia, not less jobs.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is living in November of this year, not June, like those Nova Scotians who've lost their jobs under that government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past year, 2,100 jobs have been lost in Cape Breton, while 2,300 people have exited the workforce. North Shore region, 1,400 people have lost their jobs. Another 1,400 people have just given up hope and left the workforce. In the Valley, 600 fewer jobs, 1,800 people who have stopped looking, Mr. Speaker. While in the Southern region, 2,500 people are out of work. Mr. Speaker, another 4,300 have left the workforce, Mr. Speaker, have just given up hope of finding a job. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians are worried about their jobs, Mr. Speaker, and they're worried about them being here for them tomorrow. So my question to the Premier, when will the Premier get around to focusing on job creation in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and taking on the people in this province to create jobs for the people of this province?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons why the business community in this province now enjoys some of the lowest taxation rates in 20 years is because of the works that we have done in this province, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition is being completely disingenuous with the people of the province when he uses seasonally adjusted numbers to try and justify their attack on the business community.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, did I just hear the Premier suggest the opposition are attacking the business community? Isn't it his government that's bringing in first contract arbitration? The very thing that the business community says is a direct attack on investment in the province of Nova Scotia that's being brought in by that government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier's done nothing to control power bills, Mr. Speaker. He's done nothing to control the price of gas, Mr. Speaker, and under his watch, food continues to get more expensive. But instead, Mr. Speaker, of doing everything he can to make life a little more affordable for Nova Scotians, this Premier has turned around. He's hiked taxes and fees. And, Mr. Speaker, I might add he's put the NDP electricity tax on every power bill in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, businesses can't employ people if they can't survive, Mr. Speaker, and they can't survive if they continue to live in an uncompetitive environment, Mr. Speaker, that is being created under this government. So if the Premier needs proof that his plan is not working, or he needs to do anything, if he needs, Mr. Speaker, any more proof, I should say, he should ask the 12,500 Nova Scotians who have lost their job under his watch, Mr. Speaker. So my question for the Premier, what more proof does he need that hiking taxes, Mr. Speaker, and allowing the power company to get away with murder in this province, Mr. Speaker, is not doing anything but to create jobs?
The Honourable the Premier.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard the Leader of the Opposition come up with a single solitary constructive suggestion about what to do with power rates in this province, Mr. Speaker. The reality is we had 3,000 more jobs in this province as a result of this government's efforts, Mr. Speaker, and I think the Leader of the Opposition should stop attacking the hardworking business people in this province who are trying to create jobs.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, seniors in Nova Scotia want to stay in their own homes as long as possible, an initiative known as Aging in Place that we all support. But sometimes it's simply not possible. The needs of many older Nova Scotians cannot be met without more advanced care. And often the most appropriate place for that advanced care is a long-term care facility. Mr. Speaker, the Premier used to understand that. When he was in opposition, he said, and I quote, "You can count on the NDP to ensure that Nova Scotians who need nursing home beds will have the beds they need without further delay," and I will table that quote for the benefit of the House. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this: how long are the delays Nova Scotians are facing now, today, when they need nursing home care?
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member opposite knows, it was this party that championed the seniors and their right to be able to get into long-term care facilities without having to give up everything that they had worked their lives for in order to pay for medical care. Mr. Speaker, that was this party. It is this party that opened, I think, 7 new nursing homes in this province, long-term care facilities, in order to ensure that there were appropriate numbers of beds for those who are in need of those facilities, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Well, that's very interesting, Mr. Speaker, because the fact of the matter is that as soon as the Premier got into office, he cancelled 200 planned nursing home beds, 200 planned and promised nursing home beds that were supposed to service that very need. Mr. Speaker, the Premier said when he was in opposition, why would a government rather see seniors go without service than admit they need more nursing home beds? Mr. Speaker, the wait for long-term care beds is now longer than it was when the Premier made those statements before the last election, and yet he decided to cancel the promised and funded promise of 200 more long-term care beds in our province. So I'll ask the Premier the same question today that he used to ask when he was on this side of the House. Why would the Premier rather see seniors go without service than admit that there is a need for more long-term care beds?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do no such thing. In fact, we all know that we have an aging population. We all know that there are growing requirements for models of care that are going to assist people right through the aging process. And that means providing appropriate number of long-term care beds, providing support so that people can stay in their own home, providing assisted living facilities, Mr. Speaker, and ensuring that those seniors get the kinds of facilities they need. That's going to be an ongoing process, Mr. Speaker, and it's one that this government has engaged in with communities right across the province, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, only with that Premier could meeting the needs of seniors' long-term care needs mean cutting 200 promised long-term care beds, a promise that he told the people in the last election that he would uphold. We all know, Mr. Speaker, the statistics of his own Department of Finance confirm there is a growing need for long-term care beds. In fact, by the year 2036, according to the Department of Finance, there will be double the number of people over 85 years old as there are today. That is why there was a plan to build 1,320 more long-term care beds in this province, which in opposition, the Premier said he supported. But in government, he cancelled the last 200 beds, flying in the face of the very statistics of his own department. And so my question to the Premier is this, Mr. Speaker, why doesn't he just admit that Nova Scotians can't count on the NDP to look after their long-term care needs?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's simply not true. And the reality is, Mr. Speaker, I wish the Leader of the Conservative Party was down in Shelburne County with me when I was opening the new Bayside extension, Mr. Speaker, to have those people get the right care that they need. But I'm going to ask the Minister of Health to further explain it to the Leader of the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to date, we've opened nearly 1,100 new long-term care beds. Mr. Speaker, last year, Last year, we opened an additional 475 new beds, Mr. Speaker. We invested $21 million into the system last year, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that with an aging population, there is a growing demand for not only long-term care, but continuing care. And continuing care, Mr. Speaker, includes many, many seniors who want to remain in their own homes, close to their own families. We've invested in a caregiver's benefit, Mr. Speaker. We've invested in a new program to provide snow removal and additional supports to seniors. Mr. Speaker, seniors are a priority for this government, and they will continue to be a priority for this government.
The honourable member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians have been hit hard by this NDP government, and Mr. Speaker, that includes all communities in Nova Scotia. The Aboriginal community of Nova Scotia is one of the most vulnerable communities in this province. They are faced with the highest rates of unemployment and lower rates of participation than the rest of the province. So my question through you to the minister is this: what is the economic strategy that this minister has specifically to address the needs of the Aboriginal community?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I thank the member for that very important question, because, Mr. Speaker, we just announced today we launched the workforce strategy, Mr. Speaker, which is a strategy to address the unfairness, the inequities, the underrepresentation that's occurred with governments for over 250 years, Mr. Speaker, in the province, not only for First Nations individuals, Mr. Speaker, but also for women, also for persons with disabilities, African Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, all those underrepresented groups, Mr. Speaker. We came in as a government at a time, and you know, it's fortunate for all Nova Scotians that we are the government of the day, because finally, Mr. Speaker, after 250 years of being ignored, those underrepresented groups have somebody that cares.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, it is an important question, and I'm concerned that it took 2 years for this government to decide they should look at it. Mr. Speaker, the Aboriginal community is one of the only communities experiencing that population growth in our province. And because of that, it is our future workforce, Mr. Speaker. However, this community is also one of the most vulnerable when it comes to employment. According to Statistics Canada, regarding labour force activity, the unemployment rate for the Aboriginal identity population is almost 2 times as high as it is for the province as a whole. And for people living on reserve, that rate is almost 3 times as high, and I will table those stats. In addition, the participation rate for people living on reserve is only 50%. So, Mr. Speaker, for the NDP to ignore this important segment of our population and to fail to provide an economic strategy with real targets is unacceptable. So my question to the minister is this: what specific employment targets has this minister set to combat the higher unemployment faced by the Aboriginal community?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, it gives me great pleasure to rise in my place and talk about this very important question. And you know, Mr. Speaker, you know, I'll be the first one to stand here in my place and say, yes, it took us 2 years to do this, Mr. Speaker. And do you know why it took us 2 years, Mr. Speaker? Because we wanted to plan it. We wanted to do it right. We weren't going to rush into anything. We weren't about to rush into anything and get it wrong. The problem with what governments have done in the past, Mr. Speaker, is that they've run into and tried to implement something without having an awareness and an understanding of what it actually was. Mr. Speaker, our vision is to have as many people that are underrepresented in Nova Scotia employed as possible, Mr. Speaker. That's our vision.
The honourable member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The question was, what are the employment targets that have been set? I did not hear an answer to that. Mr. Speaker, wages in Nova Scotia are among the lowest in the country for all Nova Scotians. Rural Nova Scotia is experiencing people exiting the workforce by the thousands. Again, Mr. Speaker, one of the most vulnerable communities struggling with high unemployment, and this government has no strategy to help, is the Aboriginal community. So there's no strategy, there's no target, and there's no measurable outcome. So, Mr. Speaker, when will the minister stand up for the Aboriginal community, introduce a strategy that has real targets, has real measurable outcomes, and real hope for members of this community?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, I love this question because I can stand here in my place and say in 2 years, Mr. Speaker, this government has done more in 2 years than any other previous government in the last 250 years has done when it comes to underrepresentation. And Mr. Speaker, I can also tell you this. You know what our target is? There is unlimited because we want as many. See, you know what, Mr. Speaker? We want as many people from not only the African Nova Scotian community, not only from the First Nations community, not only females, Mr. Speaker, not only from the Acadian community, not only from persons with disability, but all the groups that are underrepresented in the workforce. We want as many as possible in the workforce, Mr. Speaker, which is different than before.
The Honourable Member for Preston.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism simply has no real economic targets or measurable outcomes. This is a grave situation, and communities across the province are suffering because of the Minister's failure to grow the economy. Mr. Speaker, the African Nova Scotian community in our province suffers from higher unemployment, lower participation rates, and lower earnings than the rest of the province. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister please tell Nova Scotians what his specific employment targets are for the African Nova Scotian community?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I agree that when it comes to the African Nova Scotian community, that the financial rewards have not been there. I agree, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to the African Nova Scotian community, that they are underrepresented, Mr. Speaker, in the workplace. I also know, Mr. Speaker, I know whose fault it is. And you know what? That fault does not rest with this government, Mr. Speaker. That fault rests with Liberals and Conservatives for 250 years, ignoring the demographics of the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we will not ignore them.
The Honourable Member for Preston. On your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the stats are stark. 15.7% of African Nova Scotian males are unemployed, compared to 13.5% of males in the general population. 11.3% of African Nova Scotian females are unemployed, compared to 10.4% of females in the general population. African Nova Scotian University graduates earn an average of $12,000 per year, less than those in the general population. Like all Nova Scotian, African Nova Scotian community needs this government to deliver specific targets and measurable outcomes. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why he has no specific employment targets or measurable outcomes for the African Nova Scotian community in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, as a person of African descent, it's very heart-wrenching for me to stand here in my place, listen to a member that represents the largest African Nova Scotian community in Nova Scotia. And I know the question period is for questions for the government. But when I hear that particular member ask those kind of questions, I stand here in my place and I wonder what he has been doing for the last number of years that he's been in government, when he was in government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart to hear that member get up in his place and talk about the very individuals that he is supposed to be representing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and he has sat there for how many years and has done nothing. Finally, we've got a government that recognizes the problem, and by Jiminy Cricket, we're going to do something about it.
The honourable member for Preston. On your final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to read from the provincial website of the Office of African Nova Scotian Affairs. Quote, numbers, reports, submissions, and recommendations have attempted to define the problems, provide solutions, and establish corrective measures. However, government's accountability and resources for specific initiatives have not been consistent. There is a widespread belief across communities that the root cause of discrimination, institutional racism, and cultural bias have not been addressed. That's from the minister's own website. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain how he expects to address the problems of unemployment faced by African Nova Scotians with no specific targets or measurable outcomes?
The Honourable Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you know, this is a question that should have been raised in the House of Assembly 400 years ago. Or 249. You know what? They can make light of it. They get the point. And, you know, it's amazing. It's amazing, Mr. Speaker, that a subject as serious as this becomes a point of some laughter in the House of Assembly, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's disheartening, it's disappointing, it's all those things. Mr. Speaker, you know, it took 250 years for us to get to this point in time. It took an NDP government to get to us to this point in time. And Mr. Speaker, what we've realized as a government and what we are doing, Mr. Speaker, we are doing this, we are taking our time at it because, Mr. Speaker, we are going to do it and we're going to do it right, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this morning, the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism said the new workforce strategy will keep Nova Scotians in Nova Scotia. But, Mr. Speaker, this government will rather drive away investment, create a more risky business environment than help make a climate right to grow our economy. We can train all the people we want, Mr. Speaker, but Nova Scotia-based job creators are needed to take full advantage. Mr. Speaker, under this government's watch, we have already lost 5,900 full-time jobs net. A staggering 8,400 have left the workplace, given up in many cases. My question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, will the Minister admit he has failed the Nova Scotians and this workforce strategy will do nothing to increase actual jobs or keep trained people in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the workforce strategy is about education. It's about having a trained and skilled workforce, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's quite obvious to me, and you know, I've said this before, and no one, I remember one time I said this and somebody wanted to negotiate. Now, I'm still a little confused over that, but you know, I'm more than willing, and because it's quite obvious to me, Mr. Speaker, that there has to be an education. Has to be an education to members on the opposite side of the House, which was provided very generously to the members on this side of the House, that, you know, we are more than willing to sit down and explain how the workforce strategy One is part of the other, Mr. Speaker. And that was one of the problems that we've done before in the past, Mr. Speaker, with previous governments, is they didn't understand. They didn't understand. They might have been aware of something, but what they did is they ignored it, and by ignoring something, matters just got worse. And, Mr. Speaker, we are investing. We've invested in Nova Scotians and in companies coming to Nova Scotia, and we will continue to do that so we can grow the economy here and keep Nova Scotians here at home.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have an amazing opportunity before us with the shipbuilding contract. But this government is proving that it only hears what it wants to hear and only does what its special interest friends want it to do. Mr. Speaker, we are facing a shortage of skilled workers to take advantage of this historic contract, and this government is proving it is willing to blow it in order to appease its friends. My question for you to the Minister is, will the Minister commit to change this government's investment, frightening, high-cost, job-killing policies that are making Nova Scotia less attractive to invest in and will make it more difficult for newly trained workers to find employment in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, through our own initiative, Mr. Speaker, we've come up with a strategy. It's called Jobs Here. That Jobs Here, Mr. Speaker, we also know that with Jobs Here is that we had to implement other portions that were part of the whole Jobs Here strategy, Mr. Speaker. The workforce strategy, The workforce strategy is another way, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism has the floor for a short period of time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we support businesses in Nova Scotia. We support employment, and we support growing jobs, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invested in Maritime Pride Eggs in the northern region, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invested in LED roadway lighting, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invested in Pictou Lodge, Mr. Speaker. That's why we invested in Seaforth Energy, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a strategy. We will stick by our guns, and we will see Nova Scotia grow.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this government makes a habit of sham consulting. We saw it with the Labour Management Review Committee, the Back to Balance tour, and the new Back to Balance website with pharmacists, road builders, and the list goes on. It just proves this government has an agenda and is determined to push it through while give the mirage that it's consulting. Mr. Speaker, my question through you to the Minister of Economic and Rural Development is, will the Minister table a list of groups that were consulted for this strategy and show exactly how their input was incorporated into this document?
The Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Jobs Here strategy, we consulted wide and far. We consulted Nova Scotians. We consulted Nova Scotia businesses, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's not rocket science. We went out, we knocked on doors, we called, we did focus groups, Mr. Speaker. We talked to Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we did a very, very thorough and diverse consultation, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last Wednesday, the minister responsible for 12,500 job losses said in reference to the Yarmouth Ferry, I'll stand here in my place time and time again and say, bring forward the business case. Mr. Speaker, the latest tourism statistics from the minister's own department tell us that U.S. visits to Nova Scotia decreased by an additional 3% compared to August in 2010. The minister has argued that this is because of a global downturn in American tourism. However, Mr. Speaker, if you look at U.S. visitation to our neighbor, New Brunswick, it went up by 9% in 2010, and I'll table that document. Mr. Speaker, those Americans could have came here, but we cut off their link to this province. So my question to the minister is, how much more of a business case does he need to support investing in a Yarmouth ferry?
I would remind the honourable member from Yarmouth, when you're addressing the minister, you address him in his proper title, the Minister of Economic, Rural Development and Tourism. Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a reiteration. Is when somebody comes forward with a business case, I've said and I will maintain that we will look at that business case for, whether it be for a ferry, whether it be for a business, whether it be for anything. This is an open government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, tourism numbers coming from the U.S. have been in steady decline for the last, not the last year, not the last 2 years, not the last 5 years, Mr. Speaker, but for the last 10 years, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the ridership in the CAT was down between 75 and 80%, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it speaks for itself.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the first economic impact analysis that came out said Nova Scotians lost $25 million in profit because this government cut the Yarmouth Ferry. My question to the minister is, how much more of a business case does he need before he admits that investing in a Yarmouth Ferry is a good idea?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the member opposite keeps quoting a business case, and he keeps throwing one assumption at us, and that's what it is, Mr. Speaker. And again, Mr. Speaker, we are an open, transparent government. If the member opposite wants to come forward, give to me a business case, I will look at it, and you know what, Mr. Speaker? Decisions will be made on that business case as presented to us.
The honourable member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 3,700 jobs have been lost in southwestern Nova Scotia since this government has taken office. 4,300 people from southwestern Nova Scotia have left the workforce alone. The most recent economic impact analysis says that this negative trend can be reversed with a new ferry. How much more of a business case does this minister need?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, it's the same question. The answer is the same. Bring something forward, put it in writing, make a presentation to us. We will consider it. It will be based on its own merit, Mr. Speaker. I can't say it any clearer than that.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, when asked about Nova Scotia's plans for the CCSVI treatment last April, the Minister of Health said, and I quote, "We've said as a province, we certainly will participate in clinical trials when the scientific panel recommends that clinical trials proceed." End of quote. Since then, the Federal Minister of Health gave the go-ahead for clinical trials after a scientific working group agreed unanimously that a clinical trial should proceed at the Phase 1 and the Phase 2 levels. New Canadian research, Mr. Speaker, has reported in the Canadian Medical Journal in October that people with MS are significantly more likely to have abnormalities in their veins draining blood from the brain rather than people without MS. And after pooling the results from 8 studies, researchers in Toronto and Calgary found that MS patients were between 4 and 14 times more likely to have CCSVI than those without MS. So the scientific proof is piling up, Mr. Speaker. The obstacle holding the minister back has been removed. Now, she says she's waiting for the federal guidelines to proceed with the trials.
It's a speech.
Will the minister give Nova Scotian MS sufferers and their families some peace of mind and commit today that the province will definitely participate in trials once the federal framework has been established?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for the question. And I must say it's a very timely question. Before question period today, I was on the phone with our Federal Minister of Health, just finalizing our agenda items for Friday's agenda, when all of the health ministers from across Canada will be here in Nova Scotia along with our federal health minister. And indeed, we have a presentation from the Canadian Institute for Health Information with respect to what the guidelines will be with respect to clinical trials, and I and officials in my department are very much looking forward to that presentation so we can get on with planning our involvement. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the minister for that answer, because she had said before that the health ministers were going to be meeting here in Nova Scotia, and that is part of the reason why this question is being asked today. And as we know, Nova Scotians are among the highest number of people with MS in the country. So what we need to make sure is, and what I would ask the minister to do, is to take a real leadership role when she meets with her counterparts and push not only her fellow health ministers, but also the federal minister to proceed quickly with the guidelines for these trials. Could the minister commit to that for this meeting?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And to the honourable member and members of the House, I would say that in many respects, the research, the clinical trials are already being fast-tracked. The fact that we're at this stage in having a discussion for clinical trials is a much quicker schedule than one would ever have imagined in what generally happens with respect to other pieces of research. So indeed, we will again be looking forward to looking at the guidelines that the federal government lay out and then proceeding with plans to participate in those.
The honourable member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I know I don't have to remind the minister that time is not a friend to those who suffer with MS. And the question was, would she push her colleagues at this meeting to get this moving even faster? Now, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has a benefit of a well-recognized medical school and many physicians and scientists who do important and groundbreaking research in many fields of medicine. So my question to the minister is, what discussion has the minister had with notable Nova Scotian physicians and scientists about participation in the clinical trials, and will she tell the hosts and the MS sufferers in this province the level of interest there is in the medical research community in in being involved in the trials once the federal government has established its framework?
The Honourable Minister of Health and Wellness.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think all members of the House recognize that we're very fortunate here in Nova Scotia to have a very robust scientific and medical research community here associated with Dalhousie and with Capital Health. There is an MS research unit. I've met with many members of the research staff from the research unit. They are fully versed in the research that's been going on with respect to this particular treatment from all around the world. They attend many conferences. They read all of the publications in the learned journals, and they too have been watching the developments for clinical trials with great interest. And I'm sure after we know what the federal guidelines are, they will be prepared to give me the benefit of their expertise with respect to how they might participate, if in fact they will participate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, the Comprehensive and Economic Trade Agreement, or CETA, currently under negotiations between Canada and the European Union, is a massive deal with far-reaching implications for our agricultural community. As Canadians learn about CETA, communities across the country are raising concerns. My question to the Minister, what discussions has the Minister had with his federal counterpart about CETA and the concerns being raised about this multi-billion-dollar agreement?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member for the question. Actually, very little conversation with with the federal minister on this, and actually, this is an issue where the feds really do take the lead on it. I think at every opportunity with the federal minister, whether it's trade talks in this regard with the EU or North American or wherever, any advantages for Nova Scotia producers we pursue aggressively. And the one thing I want to make clear, and I think my colleagues across the country have done this as well, certainly in our meetings last summer, is protection for supply management is paramount, I think, across the country. I think there are not great advantages. I don't see many disadvantages, but I think there are not great advantages for the agricultural community. But certainly, I think for the fishing community in Nova Scotia, there certainly could be some advantages in these talks.
The honourable member for Kings West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as well as opening the door for the privatization of water, rumors about CETA are bound with suggestions that it threatens local procurement and democracy by putting corporate rights above public rights. Mr. Speaker, a number of municipalities, including Lunenburg, have passed resolutions demanding that provincial and territorial governments negotiate a clear, permanent exemption for local governments from CETA. My question to the Minister, as both Minister of Agriculture and Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, what is the NDP government doing to quell some of the fears about this deal?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll hand this off to the Minister responsible for intergovernmental affairs, the Premier.
Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As you would probably be aware, this is a very serious set of negotiations going on between the federal government and the European Union. As the member opposite would know, we're not a signatory to those trade arrangements. What we are, though, of course, is we have observers who are there at the table. We're providing advice to the federal government from the perspective of Nova Scotia, as other provinces are. In fact, you know, if we had more resources, we'd like to be more active in that. Quebec, Alberta have bigger trade teams. But the things that we are absolutely clear about are things like the supply managed sector, Mr. Speaker, where we would be completely opposed to anything that would affect the supply managed system in Canada. It has proved over the years to be very effective. It's been effective for farmers here in Nova Scotia, and we want to see it protected.
The honourable member for Kings West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Premier for that response. Mr. Speaker, the effects of CETA that have been clearly outlined, information coming from negotiations, will show a significant threat at the local level. Decisions regarding buying locally produced goods or food, pollution control, local job creation, control over water supply services, healthcare, and many more will be subject to the new CETA rules. My question, Mr. Speaker, for the Minister, will the NDP government speak for local farmers and oppose the CETA agreement that has devastating impacts?
Honourable the Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I pointed out, I mean, it's easy to say yes to that because, of course, we don't want to see any negative impacts on local agriculture or on local industry or on the ability, whether it's provincial or municipal governments, to manage the systems that they are responsible for as a matter of jurisdiction. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we engage on this issue in a very serious matter. There are great opportunities as well that exist as a result of trade negotiations, and generally speaking, what we see with broader and deeper markets is better ability for us to benefit from those, to create opportunities for local businesses to be able to sell products into markets that before would have been closed to them. And that's particularly true in the seafood industry, Mr. Speaker. We have not had the kind of depth of reach into the European market that we would like to have, and that would be a great benefit to all areas of the province. So we're watching very carefully. We are supplying the federal government with information about the kinds of benefits we can receive from these negotiations, but we're also warning them about what we see as things that would be problematic for our province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Agriculture. The Auditor General said on CBC's Information Morning last Thursday, in terms of inspections for protecting public safety, it's simply not adequate. He said in a news conference, the department is not adequately managing its duty to audit, in other words, inspect facilities that process meat or slaughter animals for human consumption. That failure increases public health risks associated with meat and meat products. The minister said on CBC that the AG report was not accurate. If the AG was wrong, why, in the response to the Auditor General's recommendations, did his department agree to adopt nearly every recommendation? Does this minister believe it's okay to tell the Auditor General one thing and then tell Nova Scotians something different?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think this minister believes it's important to tell everybody the same thing. And the comment I was trying to address that the Auditor General had made was that the Department of Agriculture does not get reports on foodborne illnesses, and we actually do, and we investigate them, and that was the point I was trying to make.
The honourable member for Hants West on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When it comes to the Auditor General's observations about the unacceptable length of time between inspections at meat processing facilities, the minister told CBC, and I quote, "I have to say I have to disagree with him. Even our own records indicate that someone would be there, at least try to be there 3 times, end of quote. And he went on to say, and I'll quote again, there must be a misinterpretation of the data because they'd be there at least 3 times in a year, but they may not be there once in a month, end of quote. My question to the minister is, why is he saying the Auditor General is wrong when his department said no such thing in its response to the Auditor General's report?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I did check with my staff, prior to making those comments. I want the member and all members and the Auditor General and Nova Scotians to be aware. I'm not going to split hairs with the Auditor General. He made some very good recommendations. My staff worked closely with his office on going through the information. We think that there are many things there that we can do better and intend to do better, and we fully intend to implement the recommendations, all the recommendations that the Auditor General had suggested.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for that answer. On at least 2 occasions last week, the minister said the Auditor General got it wrong. When it comes to food safety, there is no room for error. People want to know that the food they buy for their families is safe, Mr. Speaker. My question to the minister is simple. Who should Nova Scotians believe, the Minister of Agriculture or the Auditor General?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.